Sketch Talks. Hi everyone, Inkrose here with another episode of Sketch Talks. This episode we will be coloring and shading the Breath of the Wild Zelda sketch I made in the last episode. If you want to check that out, you can click here. Anyway, I will be interjecting with some commentary whenever I feel the need, mostly on Zelda-related topics and or on how I'm doing what I'm doing on the screen right now. A mistake I often see newer artists do is using the bucket tool to fill lines all on the same layer in Photoshop. This is not what you want to do because when you use the paint bucket tool to color something in, it always leaves this little white pixels right between the colors and the lines, and that can look very bad. That's not just in Photoshop though, I've seen that done in other programs like MS Paint. A good way to get around this is to actually physically color it in, and I know you might be like, but that takes so long and it's hard to color inside the lines. Well, there is a way to color inside the lines fairly easily. That is called zooming in and using pen pressure, but besides the obvious, there's also a thing called a clipping mask. Now what I did earlier is I took the wand tool and I selected all the areas outside of Zelda's lines. This was after I had made a copy of her lines, by the way, just in case. So after I used the wand tool on her lines, I pressed Command-Shift-I, which inverses the lines and selects all of inside Zelda's lines. Now that all inside her lines are selected, I can use my paintbrush to just color everywhere with the white inside that selection area, and it will draw in only the area you have selected. And that's super handy. But now you're like, well, yeah, but what if I want to put in other colors? It's still going to, go outside of that boundary I had done. Well, the way you do that and make it so that you can have multiple color layers, which you can see I have here, is you use something called a clipping mask. You make a new layer above that white colored layer, you right click it and you select make a clipping mask, and that will make it so that anything you color in on that new layer will not go outside the boundaries of that white color layer. It's very helpful and I definitely recommend it when you're using colors on a sketch. Remember though, I had made a copy of the lines before I colored them in with the wand tool. Because if you don't make a copy of the lines, all of those lines will be colored over by the white that you used, so make sure to make a copy of them. Shading works in a similar way. The way I shade is that I make every single color its own layer, which I showed you earlier, with a clipping mask tool. Once they're on separate layers, I can't make another clipping mask over that clip masked layer. I wish I could, but I can't. So the way I get around it is I use that checkerboard tool I showed you in the first video, which makes it so that when I click that checkerboard, I cannot color outside of the boundary of the layer I'm on. So for example, with the blue shirt, when I checked that checkerboard button after I'd selected the blue shirt layer, I could only shade where there was blue. This is extremely helpful, and I also suggest that you use this technique. Can I just say how happy I am that we finally got to see the new designs for the Gerudo, Zora, Gorons, more of the Rito, and more of the Koroks? Or Koroks, however they're pronounced. It was so nice to finally see their new designs, especially the Zora and Gerudo, which I was really hoping to see. One thing I am curious about, though, is the placement of this game on the timeline. As you know, I'm a big fan of Twilight Princess, and so I really hope it's in that timeline. But it doesn't really make sense when it comes to there being Rito and Koroks. However, it also doesn't really make sense that if there are Rito and Koroks, which are from, as we've seen, the Wind Waker timeline, how are there still Zora? After all, didn't the Rito evolve from the Zora? What I'm theorizing is that this is the Twilight Princess timeline. However, the Kokiri still evolved into the Koroks, out of necessity, I guess, to travel around the land. And perhaps with the Zora, some of them split off to become the Rito? Or maybe these new bird creatures aren't Ritos at all, and they're actually their own sort of creatures, because the Rito in Wind Waker looked more like a mesh between human and bird, and these new creatures look much more bird-like than the Rito did. So I'm really curious the placement of this game on the timeline, or if they even cared. It makes the most sense that it's after Wind Waker, but the problem with that is that the end game of Wind Waker, spoilers by the way, the whole thing was that the king sacrificed himself and made it so that he didn't make the selfish decision to have Hyrule back. Instead, he said, you know, children, here's your future. Your future is not Hyrule, your future is finding your own place. And so Tetra and Link go to the surface, and Hyrule is forever covered in water. Thus, in Spirit Tracks and in Phantom Hourglass, they find a new land and new kingdom. And that becomes the new Hyrule. This game, Breath of the Wild, can't take place in the new Hyrule. For one, there's no train tracks everywhere. And for another, there's a lot of cities and landmarks we know from good old Zelda, like Ocarina of Time. There's Death Mountain we can see. There's Hyrule Field, Hyrule Castle. So where is this on the timeline? There's no way that this is after Wind Waker. It just doesn't make sense. It could be, but it would take a lot of explaining, that's for sure. In any case, I'm very excited to see where they go with this. We'll see! To add on to that last point, I have to wonder about the Gerudo. Now, if this game does indeed take place after Twilight Princess, why is there a Gerudo girl here? You see, for one thing, we know that in this timeline after Ocarina of Time, the young Link, he came back from the adult timeline and warned young Zelda and her father, the king, about Ganon and Ganon's plans. Now, the king is furious. The king takes Ganon, and Ganon is banished to the Twilight Realm as shown in Twilight Princess. And it's heavily implied that the Gerudo are taken prisoner in that sand dungeon and basically disposed of. Now, it wasn't ever said that all of the Gerudo were disposed of, so maybe that's how this new Gerudo is here. Maybe some of them escaped the Hylian army and went off by themselves. Now this is kind of interesting too, because if the Gerudo are an all-female race, how are they going to reproduce? Because, as said in the games, the way they reproduce is by luring Hylian men and having fun with them. So, but we'll see. Maybe it's explained, maybe it's not. Another little note I'd like to add is that it looks like we see part of the Zora queen or king in one of these shots. Like right here at the side, it looks like there's another Zora sitting on the throne, and when you look at the trailer, it's moving. So maybe it's a Zora queen or king. Also, there's this other creature we see in the screenshot that looks like some kind of werewolf tusked manatee? I don't know, we'll see. Maybe it's a brand new race, which would also be extremely interesting. And over here it looks like we see, I'm guessing, a fairy, because it looks like she's jumping out of a fairy fountain. And also she has these little like butterfly aspects to her, like this little hairpiece here, which makes me think that she's a fairy. Gosh, that part with Zelda crying was so heartbreaking. It was really surprising too. It really, like I said in the last video, it really showed me that this game will be a lot more story focused than we thought it would be. Speaking of heartbreaking things, I miss Fi. I really hope she's going to be in this game in some aspect. Seeing the Master Sword in such a condition made me really kind of concerned for her. I hope she's alright, and I really hope she comes back in some sort of way in this game. It doesn't have to be very overt, but maybe some little hints here and there, like the Master Sword glowing or blinking, something like that. Just to know that she's okay. Thank you so much for joining me in this. I had a lot of fun with this illustration. Next video, I will be talking about Dragon Queen and how I came up with the concept. Hope to see you then. Also, you can support these videos on Patreon. Link in the description.